It's a real pleasure to be with you here this evening. As I understand, most of you are soon-to-be lawyers, or some maybe are lawyers. And so what I'd like to talk about a little bit is what is going on with blockchains and smart contract technology. First, I'm going to talk a little bit at a technological and theoretical level. And then in the middle bit, I'm going to talk for a while about what a few of the projects that we're involved with or that we know about and how they relate specifically, what they look like and what they relate to in terms of their legal applications. And then finally, I'm going to take a little bit more of an in-depth look at what smart contracts actually look like and potentially will be trying to tease out some of the legal issues that might be around as we talk about those things. So a lot of people, when they first hear about this technology, they hear about it through the lens of Bitcoin. And as I understand, previous person has talked a little bit about Bitcoin and some of the theoretical ideas that underpin that of non-sovereign issued money and some of those things. I think that's all very interesting, but I think it's kind of the wrong lens to look at this, through which to view the technology if you're talking at a technological level. So for us and how we view this technology, what blockchains are fundamentally all about is it's about giving networks access to verifiable data. Now, a lot of people tend to use the words trust or trustless when they're talking about blockchains and Bitcoin and smart contract technology. I think that trust, as a lawyer, I find trust to be an inherently ambiguous word, and I very much dislike the use of the word trust and trustless when talking about systems, because in general, I don't believe that systems are trustless or lack trust, I mean to say. I prefer to think of these in terms of verifiable data. Now, that's all interesting, and lawyers have a little bit to do with data, but really lawyers are about process. So what has gotten me excited about this technology is what you can do with smart contracts, which are really be able to put in place verifiable process. So this lecture isn't going to talk about miners, and it's not going to talk about security, and I hope that there will be very little technobabble in this talk in the time that we're here together. If there is technobabble, please raise your hand and ask me if I do use too much jargon, because I fully intend not to. The lens in which I really view this technology, with that introduction aside, is this business process improvement software. What do I mean by that? We've had a lot of technologies that have come into play over the course of the last 20 years that have sought to put in place business process automation sequencing within enterprises. But the challenge that that technology has is that because it's computers and because no one can really trust, I use that word, verify code that's running on machines that you don't control, what has happened with business process automation software is that it is stopped at the front door of the organization. So you can have tons of SAP and very big, complex business process automation suites, and if you walk down the halls of pretty much any airport on Earth, what you'll find is a whole lot of business process automation advertisements, because those are usually selling to consultants who do a lot of travel, and therefore they're at the airports. But what about business processes that cut across stakeholders? In other words, if we look at a contract or any deal that we're talking about, you can generally break those you can generally break the provisions of a contract down into what I'm supposed to do, what you're supposed to do, and then what we're supposed to do together, right? And I can put in place business process automation for what I'm supposed to do, and you can put in place business process automation for what you're supposed to do. But for those things that we're supposed to do together, or we're supposed to notify each other, it could be as simple as a notification. It could be as complex as coming to a decision about the next round of a particular deal, if we're talking about an umbrella deal. So it can be very simple, it can be very complex, but there are always duties which end up being collective. And there has not been a real technology base on which we could build automation systems that would deal with our relationships, and particularly around our data-driven relationships. And this is what is the promise and the hope and what is really super exciting, to me at least, about smart contract technology. Does anybody have any questions so far? Awesome. All right. I've either confused you or not. All right, so that's interesting, right? Everybody has business process automation challenges. Everybody has business processes that they want to improve. Lawyers are pretty much almost always involved in those business processes because they link to legal duties that the organization has. So what can we do with this technology? Here are a few of the things that are currently being built using smart contract systems. And there is a big, kind of, at this point, heavy push right now within the finance industry to use this technology and to leverage it to decrease their costs. And I spend pretty much 3/4 of my days lately talking to bankers, and often what they really want to be able to do is to make redundant a significant amount of their middle and back office. Now, what are those people doing that they want to be made redundant? Generally, what they're doing is checking information that was sent to them by a person that pretty much has their same title at a different bank, or sending information to someone that pretty much has their same title at a different bank. In other words, they're doing reconciliation or they're doing notification, right? Generally, this is what these individuals will be doing. Now, humans aren't particularly great at these things. In fact, humans make a lot of errors in these areas, and we're slow. We're much slower, for example, than computers. But the reason that we have these checks, the reason that banks have these checks involved in these systems, is because we can't necessarily trust what is happening outside of the computing systems that we control. Now, smart contracts, why can we do that? Well, if we go back a little bit to what actually a smart contract is. I'm going to leave these up so you can sort of digest them. But a smart contract is simply a computing script that has been saved within the ledger of a blockchain. And when it receives a transaction, it executes its sequence. It's dead simple. It's essentially, it's just a script that exists in one location, and if you send it a transaction, it runs itself. That's it. Now, what is interesting about, thank you. What is interesting about this technology isn't necessarily that the computers run themselves. That's what computers do generally. It's that if I am running a node on a particular network, my computers will be running this script. If you're running a node on this particular network, your computers will be running the exact same script in the exact same way, without any fail. Anybody else that's on the network, their computers will also be running the same network, the same process, at the same time, using the same parameters, and they will come to the same outcome And if they don't, then they will negotiate as to who's right and who's wrong. Now that is what is fundamentally different from a system architecture perspective about this technology. Now, bonds. I'm going to talk through here 3 use cases. The use cases up there that have been underlined. And I'm going to start with a finance use case. In other words, why is this stuff interesting and what is happening with it? Well, when you look at bonds, you have a deal. And in a term sheet of a bond, does anybody have a banking background? Anybody else? Anybody else interested in banking at all? All right. Okay, for those that aren't interested in banking, I'll try to make this a little bit quick, but I'll also try to explain what's going on here. You can apply this mechanism to a whole range of deals if you really wanted to, but I'm going to focus on bonds because I find it quite interesting, as well as we've done a decent amount of work in this area. Now, financial assets aren't necessarily just about an object definition. When you look at how a bank actually tracks what assets it has, it needs to track not only what that asset is, but also, at times, where that asset is within a process flow. In other words, a bond is much more than just its ISDN number and its amount and its interest payment. It's a bundle of rights and responsibilities. And those rights and responsibilities are divergent across a whole range of stakeholders that are involved. Typically, what will happen if a moderate or large-sized company needs to be able to raise some cash, and they are going to do it via a bond, you'll have multiple banks which will be involved in the underwriting or initiation process. And then after that, you'll have multiple parties that will be involved during the administration and life cycle of this bond. Not only will you have the people that will be owning a particular bond be involved in the process, you also have trustee agents, calculation agents, trustees, and calculation agents, along with a whole range of stakeholders. How this currently works today, let's start with modification events. Let's say there needs to be a change in the terms of this bond. Generally, what will happen today, pardon me, is that sufficient quorum of the bondholders will get on the phone and be read the terms of the change and orally give a yes or no vote to the trustee, who will then tell the calculation agent that some term has been adjusted. Now, imagine a bunch of Wall Street traders or London City traders trying to remember when they have their bondholder meetings because they need to change the terms of this event. And then imagine them literally getting on the phone and listening to someone read them the legalese as to the change of terms. Is this sufficient? No, hell no. This is not efficient at all. This is a giant waste of everybody's time and money, right? And money is what it really boils down to. We've calculated that a simple modification event can cost usually the issuer, sometimes the underwriter, depending on the deal, but usually the issuer, somewhere around between $100,000 and $200,000. And that's a significant amount of money to just change what is fundamentally a pretty small thing. Why does it cost a lot of money? Because you have a lot of stakeholders involved in the system. Now, if we could build an automation component that would cut across all of these stakeholders and would keep everybody informed as to what the proposed change is and what would happen if this change went into effect, and also would use a very strong way in which to electronically sign what your vote is. I think we've dramatically, at that point, we've dramatically increased our efficiency, and we've reduced costs, of course, but also we've really dramatically increased our ability to verify something, right? Because while if you get on a phone call, somebody is probably recording that phone call, it's not nearly as strong as a cryptographic signature that exists in a rock-solid ledger that has been built up over time and is unable to be kind of unraveled. And why is that important? Litigation, right? I mean, it's a hell of a lot easier to prove this if you have a strong record of proof than it is if you just have an oral recording, right? So what we have been able to do is to take an entire bond sheet, every single action that was to take place at the initiation of the bond, every single action that was supposed to take place during the modification events, everything that was supposed to take place throughout the life cycle down to events of default, and we've been able to program those in smart contracts. Now, what's interesting about this for lawyers isn't necessarily that we've been able to do it, but it's what happens to folks that are bond lawyers, right? Because we've been able to program one style of bond term sheet, and that's fine, but if we're able to sufficiently cover and code most of what the bond term sheets are, and if all of these things execute themselves in exactly the same way, because they're computer code, and that's what computer code does, then what happens to bond lawyers? Is this still a thing anymore? I don't know. It's definitely an open question. The second use case I'd like to talk about is in insurance. Insurance is very interesting because you have a lot of challenges, and you have a lot of stakeholders involved in any insurance system. One of the big challenges that suppliers have is that when they take out an insurance policy, they end up getting an insurance policy that might last a year or 2 years or 5 years or 3 years. But when they take out that insurance policy, generally what they'll do is take somewhat of a daily average of what their stock is. Maybe they'll go up or down depending on what the particular economics of this supplier are. And then they'll take out an insurance policy on that amount. And the theory here is that sometimes you'll be underpaying and sometimes you'll be overpaying on what your actual stock that you currently have possession is, as opposed to what your insurance policy says you're insured for. Now, I'm seeing a little bit of a funny look. So let's imagine that you are a car dealership, and you have stock which is constantly fluctuating, right? And you want to make sure that you are insured, so if some crazy anti-car people come and try to blow up your car lot, that you're taken care of, right? This is why we buy insurance. Now, but you never actually are insured for what you actually are currently in possession of. I guess at times it will happen, but very rarely will it actually happen. So at times you're underpaying, at times you're overpaying, and maybe it all equals out, or maybe it doesn't. But what you have to understand is that you're locked in for a given period of time, for maybe a year, 2, 3, 5 years, depending on whatever your insurance policy is. Well, what if we had a way in which we could accurately track within a supply chain, within a system, who owned what and when? Well, fundamentally, if you look at Bitcoin, that's what Bitcoin is. It's a property register of who owned what when. And when I send you a Bitcoin, I'm not actually sending you a Bitcoin. I'm transferring title over a certain set of data to you. And this is mostly how courts have come out on this, is that it's property and you can transfer title. Now, when it comes to the car dealership, if he or she had a record of how many cars were owned and in stock at any one time, not owned, but generally they're on consignment, at any one time, and that was an unassailable record, then everybody involved in his system, maybe his bank, maybe her insurance company, depending on what we're talking about, would also have access to a strong record of who owned what when. Now, here's where things get quite interesting from an insurance company's perspective. Because from an insurance company's perspective, the biggest thing that most insurance companies are worried about is fraud and claims. That's the number one thing when you talk to insurance people. That's what really concerns them, because that's where their real problems come from a business perspective. They don't mind covering losses that were actual losses. I mean, that's what they're in the job of doing, but they're worried about covering losses that weren't actual losses. So if you were to build a real-time policy coverage system in smart contracts, which we're about to do, and other startups have done, what you're able to do is reduce fraud requirements, reduce the risk of fraud significantly. You're not going to take it to zero because, in my opinion, you're never going to take fraud or corruption to zero. But you can reduce it significantly vis-a-vis a situation where no one actually knows who owned what when, outside of some paper records that could easily be forged. And you've cut the costs potentially for both parties involved in this transaction, both of the car dealership in this hypothetical as well as the insurance company, depending on how the policy sets up, because the economics skew one way or another at any one particular moment. And both have access to essentially a little bit more cash in hand at any one time, and obviously that'll kind of be a zero-sum game. The third use case I'd like to talk about. How am I doing on time? Is there a clock in here? Cool. I'm out of time. All right. I'll see you later. The third thing I'd like to talk about is something that's near and dear to my heart. For years I did governance reform, and I've been deeply involved in numerous reforms of government policy in the Horn of Africa. So I really, really like this third bucket over here of governance applications of this technology. And one of the main use cases that is very, very clear to me in which you can use smart contracts is what I'm calling budget transparency or capital projects. So let's imagine for a moment that a new highway is going to be built. And I must admit that I'm completely ignorant on the governance systems of Belgium, but I'm pretty sure that there is multiple levels between a city and the top level government, right? Yeah. You can say it. All right. I figured that was a safe assumption. So if a new highway is being built, typically what's going to be happening is that various governments or public bodies will be pooling money into a set of bonds or whatever in order to fund a new highway that's being built, right? So you have public money, generally public money. Sometimes there's private money, but typically we're talking about public money that has come from various budgets out of different, well, it's not P&L for governments, it's budgets, but it's coming out of different budgets from different governmental organizations. And it gets pooled in. And typically how this is handled today is that one of the big accounting firms is asked to come in and they're paid a decent amount of money to manage the distribution of that pool. And what they end up doing is they make wholesale distributions to general contractors. Let's say maybe there's 4 or 5 that are involved in a typical highway build. Maybe one to do the under the road, one to do the road, one to do the sides of the road, whatever it is. And then those general contractors, they don't actually do all the work. Typically, they do very little bits of the actual work. Most of the work is then subcontracted out. And then after that, after the subcontractors do their work, they have to report back that they did their work to generally the general contractors. Then the general contractors have to report back that their tranche of work has been done, and that goes up then to the fund administrator, who then says, yeah, you did the work, and here's the next tranche of money in order to continue building the next 5 kilometers of the highway, or whatever it is. Now, this is an excellent use case for smart contract technology. Why? Well, you have numerous stakeholders involved, and you're talking about public money here, which is meant to be transparent, right? We're supposed to know what our governments are doing with public money, of course. And you have a whole lot of processes that are typically involved in the report back up before I give you more money part of the deal, right? Now again, this is very general contracting that's involved. If you look at it from a lawyer's point of view, it's not that complex. It's a little bit complex around engineering. It's a little bit complex when things change or shift. But in general, the contracts aren't that complex. And most of this can be built in code, which means that we have a completely transparent, completely automated system that is completely verifiable, that all of the requirements and processes that had been built into the code were done correctly. Now, obviously, the smart contract system is a bunch of computers running code. It has no ability to actually know that the road was built. So let's just be clear there. It can't verify that the road exists in the real world. I hope that's clear, but sometimes people get weird ideas about this technology. But it can verify that certain reporting requirements were fulfilled. Now, questions before I move on. You guys are not many questions. Is it because I'm American? You scared of us Americans? I don't have a gun on me, so. All right. Is any of this clear? Or is this just, am I talking like I might as well be talking Martian right now? Okay.
We are used to not understand it after.
Okay, all right. Well, I just wanted to take a quick break. Okay, great. So, how do smart contracts work? Well, from a lawyer's point of view, generally the way that I always begin is by taking a look at what are the objects that are involved in a particular system. So because it's what I do most of my days, let's talk about financial objects. But that object could be anything. It could be a bit of the highway that was supposed to be built. It could be a car that you are insuring. It could be the insurance policy itself. These objects are just kind of, within computing terms, they're pretty abstract concepts. They're meant to be abstract concepts. In a financial object, generally what you have is you have 2 components of it, okay? You have the parameters of the object, which are the identification, ownership, past ownership, whatever you really need to track as a parameter of a particular object. So if this is a particular bond or this is a particular syndicated note syndicated loan or a particular mortgage or a particular stock of equity within a company. Whatever the object is, generally you will be identifying it in some way. So what you will typically start with is, what are the parameters? Now, how does this relate to contracts? Like contracts? Well, typically this is the stuff that will be either in your term sheet or in the heads of terms, and it'll typically be in the first few. Well, I can't say this, but at least in most Anglophone contracts, it'll be typically in the first few provisions. So it's who are the parties, what's going on here, these types of things. All right? The next thing that you have to understand, though, is that objects generally are going to move around or do things or whatever, else they're not very interesting otherwise, right? And so typically what you will look at is, what is the interface of this object? Okay, interface is a computing term, a little bit of a term of art. I hope it's not too jargony, but generally what it means is what am I supposed to do before I'm originated, or during my origination process, or after I'm originated but before I'm traded, or during my trade, or after my trade. Now, if we're thinking about trades, if we're thinking about financial assets, those can be potentially encumbered in a few ways. If those encumbrances have been perfected, generally, I don't know if these are American law terms, so maybe somebody can help me out if these aren't terms which are familiar under Belgian law. But anyway, when you have an encumbrance on a particular asset, that is generally then registered with somebody, and then that is perfection of the encumbrance. Are these foreign concepts completely, or everybody okay here? Okay, let me tell you. So if you buy a house but you have a mortgage on that house, that mortgage is an encumbrance typically. Okay. Yeah. So there is a security. It's something like a security. Yeah, it's closely related. So we use encumbrance as a more generic term. We use security as a quite precise term. Yes. My French is awful, so I'm not even going to try. But, so you have that. And so generally, one of the things that you would probably put within an object's interface is, before I'm actually able to trade this object, has the current owner, is it encumbered as it is currently owned? In other words, typically with an encumbrance, it means that you cannot sell that object unless you get the clearance of the party in which owns the encumbrance, right? And so you would put such a check typically in the trading sequence, somewhere before the trade, after the trade, during the trade, whatever, it depends. And that would probably depend on the regulations in whatever this jurisdiction this trade was being conducted. You also have event of default, you also have modification events, and generally all the stuff that everybody else that's not lawyers would call fine print or legal bullshit, which that is a technical term of art. But that we as lawyers care about, right? This is what we do, for better or worse, on a daily basis. So all of that fine print or legalese is typically what we would put actually within what we call smart contract engines, okay? So if we have an interface, what we typically do is we connect it into a whole series of engines, and these engines do various things for us, okay? Maybe this engine up here checks that the asset that's about to be encumbered, that is about to be traded, has not been encumbered. Maybe this engine right here is in charge of tracking changes or modification events in the votes of the bondholders, if we're going back to that example. And so all of these engines here, typically we build them so they do one thing and they do it well. And then what we can do is we can plug in a whole bunch of different individual objects into these engines. Okay. So now I'm going to go to this board. Let's talk about something that's super simple, right? Let's talk about the most simple smart contract I can possibly imagine that would be somewhat of interest to a lawyer, okay? Okay. If I die, pay my partner, right? And let's say I tell my bank that, in my bank we're in some weird future state where we're going to pretend that probate courts don't exist, and that I just tell my bank, if I die, pay my partner. All right. Now, what does this actually look like? Well, on the one hand, the first thing that we have to consider here is if I die, right? Now, how are the computers going to know that I'm dead?
Because the death certificate will be issued by
Right.
local.
Great. But this is like the future of the world type stuff. So like death certificates from the government, yeah, but that's kind of old school, right?
If your heart stops beating,
Well, how does the computers know that?
you need a sensor or something.
What?
You'd need a sensor.
Okay, Fitbit.
Yeah, for example.
Or do you guys know the jawbone, like the little things you wear around your wrists?
Yeah, but you take it up and then you...
Yeah, of course, yeah. I'm getting to that part. I'm getting to that part.
Virtually
Yeah. How else? Let me, instead of Fitbit, let me just say sensors. All right. Maybe you take it off at night, but your Nest knows that you're in the house, so you're okay. Any other ways that computers can know that I'm dead?
Facebook.
Social media? Okay. It's probably good enough to prove my point, but are there any others? Might be interesting.
When you don't use your computer?
Sorry?
When you no longer use your
Yeah, that's fair.
Or your phone or anything.
Yeah. That sort of links to sensors, but let me see, how can we call it? No use of computing. Okay, that probably gets us enough. All right. Now comes the question, death certificates from governments. Has anyone ever heard a story about somebody being dead that wasn't dead? Dead according to the government that wasn't dead according to biology? All the time. There's stories of this all the time, right? People get names wrong. Death certificates are often screwed up. Not often, but it's certainly not a zero event occurrence, right? So do I want to fully trust the government's...
The opposite is true as well.
Sorry?
The opposite is true as well.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And then you just have to take many of them and go with a threshold.
You keep jumping way ahead of me, man. I'm joking. Yes, you're right. Like, we don't necessarily want to put everything in that bucket, right? Sensors, we already identified. If you take the sensor off or the sensor is out of range, that's no good. Social media, I think there's a whole lot of ways that one's not very good. And as far as knowing when you're dead, And you also have use of computers. Now, what we can do, of course, is we can combine these. And so let's say that we have decided that if all 4 of those are true, then that is what means that I'm dead, okay? So what this actually means is, oh, I can't do that. Okay, so if all of the above is true, then I'm dead. Okay. Now, where are we going to get this information from? Generally, we'll get it from data feeds that have come into our computing system, right? That should be pretty clear to you guys at this level. All right. So if all of these are true, then I'm dead. Now, what we have done here is we've really built one of these engines here. Okay, so the object of my will is probably, if we're talking about, this one's more simple. If we're talking about the parameters, it's probably the name of my partner, the address of my partner, her bank account number perhaps, my name, my details, national identification number, whatever it is, bank account number. And those are all included here in the parameters. And I left them out of our fake smart contract up here. But what we're talking about in the first bit is the first bit of an interface. So if dead interface, right? And we've decided that we're going to have all 4 of these must be true in order for me to be actually dead. And I have put all of these checks into an engine, right? So, all in all, fairly simple, I hope, at least at a conceptual level. Pay partner. Well, if I know who my partner is, then essentially what this is it becomes a payment instruction to my bank. And that's pretty simple. It's pretty boring, right? I just tell my bank, put the money that used to be in my account in my partner's account. Now, what if my bank doesn't have the details of my partner, or I didn't tell my bank who my partner was? Well, in the land of some blockchains, this is really already happening. No one is necessarily controlling the pay partner part of this outside of the contract itself. The contract generally acts as more of an escrow contract where tokens of value are sent to a holding contract that then has a simple if statement, and if the if statement is satisfied, then it will release its payment to somebody else, right? Now, this happens today all the time, and it causes lawyers nightmares for those that are involved in this process that are also regulated entities. Now, if you're just an individual and you wanted to do this on Bitcoin and not to use any regulated agencies or intermediaries, you can do this today, right now. The problem that you will have, though, is any money that you would be putting in this, you aren't really going to have access to, because it's going to be basically locked up in the smart contract until, or the escrow, until the event is actually satisfied. This went faster than I expected. That's really all I had prepared. So maybe this gives us a little bit longer for questions. How am I doing on time? Yeah? Okay, good.
3 minutes.